It all started with a very simple idea. Tell the stories of how successful middle market CEOs made it to the corner office. I'm Brant Handley, founder and managing director of Resource Options International, or ROI. We're the USA's premier executive search firm focused exclusively on empowering middle market companies to attract, hire, and retain A players while transforming top executives' careers and lives. ROI's Into the Corner office is dedicated to discovering how middle market CEOs advance their career, and we're making these remarkable and sometimes quite unbelievable stories available to you for the very first time. Listen and learn about the challenges they've overcome, the interesting people they've met along the way, and the lessons learned that steered these executives' unique journey into a middle market corner office of their own. I know you enjoy these CEO stories as much as I've enjoyed recording them. So thank you for listening today. And if you like what you've heard, rate us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm looking forward to you joining me on the next great middle market CEO adventure into the corner office. My guest today is Rohan Widdison, CEO of New Laboratories. Rohan knows that beauty is more than skin deep. He has over 30 years of experience in the sector with a demonstrated history of success working in the cosmetics manufacturing, formulation, and distribution industry. What sets Rohan apart, though, is his continued focus on looking outside the box. The New Laboratories founder insists, quote, "We need to place a focus on what new formulations can we learn about before how clients even know about it and how we can be on the front foot of it, period." The CEO attributes his work ethic to his mother, stating, "If I didn't have a very strong, focused, and savvy mother, I wouldn't be where I am today. I owe my drive to her." With partner Belinda and son William in his corner, Rohan shows perspective and gratitude when reflecting on his business journey, citing the reason for his success originating from opportunity. Rohan Widdison, welcome into the corner office.
Thanks, Brant.
Great to have you here. You're recording on the other side of the planet. I'm in my beautiful little apartment here in New Haven, Connecticut, but I believe you are in Australia today, if that's correct.
That's right. I'm down in Melbourne, Australia. We're kind of in the middle of our winter while hopefully you're enjoying your summer.
Yeah. And we've heard a lot in the news about Australia with the pandemic and lockdowns. I think you're under a recent one, or at least I think the East Coast was in Sydney. How has it been where you are?
It's been an interesting journey. We're in lockdown 6.0. This is our sixth one. I think we've had probably close to about I'm going to say maybe 140, 50 days of lockdown since it started.
Oh my gosh! Wow,
so it's interesting, but it actually makes you resilient, and I mean, this is part of the new world.
That's right. That's right. Well, glad that you're there and safe, and just great to have you on the show. And we always like to kick it off to understand a little bit about the early years. So tell us a little bit about where you grew up and what your early family life was like.
Yeah. Look, growing up in Australia is I grew up through the 70s, and it was fairly basic. I would probably say Australia really didn't emerge into a world economy until the 80s. So it was very much an insular type of experience. But I suppose that makes you resilient as a person, and it probably prepares you for the future because you're so far away from the rest of the world. You've got to be innovative.
Did you grow up in the Melbourne area?
I was born and grew up in Melbourne. It was, I suppose an atypical family situation, probably with the different spin that my mother was already running her own company in the beauty sector, which is, going back into the 60s and 70s, that was kind of...
it's early days, very innovative. Yeah.
Early days, and for a female to do that was probably groundbreaking in the Australian context, because that was very much, mum looks after the kids at home. In this case, mum ran a company. So it was a really good experience to see how that sort of unfolded as far as our life. It wasn't an atypical one, but it certainly opened insights.
What about Dad? Was he involved in the business, or do you have another career?
No, my dad was actually in construction, so very, very different. I think my parents were two very different people that found, something that worked for them, and it was different. I mean, Mum was working 6-7 days a week, and
wow. Yeah.
I mean, Dad was I suppose the mum, the dad, and everything else in between when it came
Yeah.
to growing up. But that doesn't mean
Right.
to say you
Right.
didn't have a great mum who was there and showed you um, everything you could be. I mean, it was very much if you want something, this is how you go about it, and it wasn't a situation where you would just go, "Hey, mum, I want." Mum would say, "Okay, how do you achieve that?" And
Yeah.
you work for everything.
Right. Right.
Yeah,
Well, and she led you in the industry. We'll get to talk about that in a moment. So it's very
definitely.
exciting. Now, brothers and sisters?
I have one brother who's a year
Yeah.
older, and
Okay.
he sort of entered the industry briefly, and I think
Uh-huh.
he ran away quite fast,
I
which
decided it wasn't for him.
it wasn't for him. No, I think this is an industry that's it's a little bit creative, so you've got to be thinking on your toes all the
Sure.
time.
Sure.
It's not it's not your 9 to 5 type of business.
Yeah, yeah. Now, Australia, as is the U.S., is known for its immigrants, and
Mm.
I know you have a name that would not be typically English in that regard. So, do you go back some generations with regards to immigrants?
Oh,
Where's your family originally from?
oh, the family name goes back to convict days.
Oh,
So I traced it all the way back to I think it was like 1837.
wow,
Um,
wow, cool.
it seems like some distant relative stole a chicken in England. Uh,
And they sent them
what?
off to Australia.
And
Lucky you.
and yeah, and they decided to back in those days we were a really good landing ground for everything that England didn't want,
Right, right, right.
and I thanked them for it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I love that. What about early influencers? Who are some of the folks? I mean, it sounds like mom had a pretty big role, and we'll talk more about her as we get into your career. But were there special coaches or teachers that had an influence on you early on?
Look, mum was probably the big influence. I mean, I
Yeah.
suppose if I go back, childhood it was if you want something, then it's up to you. I think the big influence was when I started working with my mum in her company. My mum said, "You really don't want to be here. I'm not paying you." Pretty much, she said, I'm not going to pay you." And her comment was, you've got to make the business if you want to get paid."
Hmm.
And it was simply
Interesting.
that. And when I started, that was in '87. It was only just on the edge of the stock market crash. So it went from
Wow.
okay, I'm doing something, I'm getting somewhere, to I'm paying wages on my credit card because
Right.
there was no handouts, and
Yeah.
it was
Yeah.
really bleak. So it set really a tone for resilience and for
Yeah.
watching what you do as a person, and as a company. And even today, I look back, and when staff say, "Let's do this and let's do that," in my head, I'm going, "Do do I want to be loaded up with debt
Right.
waiting
Right.
waiting for the next crash?" Because
Yeah. Yeah.
if I go look at, say, the past 12 months, give the pandemic as an example, um, we were, I suppose, very fortunate here that the government had a thing called JobKeeper, where they were literally, paying companies to keep staff on,
Right.
which was, a really good form of, um, retaining your staff. But
Yeah.
in some respects, it was overly generous welfare,
Right. Right.
and it kind of exposed companies to, are you overcommitted? Can you really, are you resilient? And in our particular case, I look back and go, hmm, everything that I learned growing up really reflects upon how we actually, thrived in the last 12 months. We came into a
Hmm.
pandemic with no debt.
Yeah.
We're not a lean operation, but we're a very efficient one. And a lot of that's borne out, from the early days. When I go back,
Sure.
my mum said, "Hey, there's no free handouts, you've got to generate everything you want." So,
Right. Right.
it
Good. Good
sounds
philosophy.
a good philosophy. It sounds kind of harsh, um, and and
That's okay.
as a 19-year-old back then starting out, it's like, really, I had to live on $100 a week. Um, but if I look at today, it's like, thank you very much, mum.
Yeah, it's a good
Um,
lesson to learn. Yeah. Were
yeah.
you good? Were you a good student in school, Ryan?
Um, at high school, I would say I was extremely average.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I passed high school. I went to university. I originally studied politics and criminology.
Huh?
I was probably, I don't know, somewhere. Once again, I was somewhere in the average. Um, and where I actually, I suppose academically, where I actually thrived, wasn't till I hit the 2000s. I went back, whilst still working. I did a law degree, and
Right.
I actually found the academic side of law was kind of what really
Yeah.
excited me. And so I went from being
Gotcha.
in my original arts degree being an average student to going to high distinctions.
Right. Right.
When got excited in that area, I actually went on and did a Master of Laws at Strathclyde University in Scotland, and that was kind of an interesting thing. Once again, it's like, oh wow, this is something that's I suppose sparks my interest.
Right.
And I never went on and pursued law. It was kind of one of these things where I went back to say, is this a plan B?
Yeah.
And
Right. Right.
and I
Have
just
that in your back pocket.
had it
Yeah.
in my back pocket. Loved it academically. I think I would have loved to have been a lecturer at university, but
Sure.
business called again, and that's that was, I suppose, my first love.
Did you have some entrepreneurial tendencies as a kid? Things that you did growing up? In the U.S., we kind of have the ubiquitous paper route where, the kids at, single digits or well in the early 10, 11, 12 years would have that. And was that kind of part of your growing up as well? Or did mom kind of throw you in the business and say, sink or swim?
I did have one rather failed entrepreneurial venture. So myself and my brother, we used to race BMX on the national circuit here,
Oh,
and
right, cool.
so that was kind of, I suppose, our sport growing up, and fortunate to have parents who would support you during that and happy to fly you around the country, which was kind of amazing.
Right, right.
And I had this great idea to do this fiberglass seat post for racing, and I thought,
Hmm.
yes, this is great, this will sell. Um, yep, I was probably the only person who actually really wanted one. Um, but my uncle was in engineering, and he set me up with all the titanium and fiberglass and everything,
Wow. Wow,
and
cool.
I hand built them, and then I realized nobody wanted them. So I think that says a lot about let's do your market research properly.
Well, it taught you about consumer needs, right? Yeah.
It's like, so I mean, it's kind of funny when a client comes to us even today. I go, does anybody really want this? Uh,
Yeah, right, right.
and you kind of go back. I've got some fiberglass seat posts in my backyard if you'd like. But
Let me tell you this story. I love
let me tell you the story. But I mean,
it.
they're all good things from childhood.
Sure.
And if I actually, if I go back and you go like, these are the things my parents did. I think my parents were actually a bit generous when you think about it. I think my son's now paying for this. So
I love it. Well, you went on and got a number of degrees. As you mentioned earlier, you got your law degree, but you studied politics and I think education as well as undergrad.
correct.
Did you have some aspirations with regards to, public service? Or was that where your interest is at that time, or what led you to that field of study?
Um, No, look, public service was never on the top of my agenda. I mean,
Uh-huh.
I had this brief fleeting idea that politics might be something,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and I was briefly involved in the Liberal Party here, which is the equivalent, I suppose, the Republican America.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Um, and then I sort of you looked inside and you go, really? That's
Not really what I want to do.
that's not getting me excited.
Yeah. Yeah.
So no, I mean there wasn't, that brief look inside, was like, no, one getting involved in one campaign was enough.
Right. Right.
So look, I think I don't know, it's one of these things where I had no rule book besides mum.
Yeah.
I mean, mum said if you want anything, you've got to do it yourself. So I didn't have really a rule book, which is a plus and a minus.
Right.
You kind
Right.
of look back and go, gee, it would have been really great to intern at a large company in the sector to really get into what it means to do what they do and how do they build it. But then that would have been a set of rules I would have followed that probably would have had a very different outcome.
Sure.
Um,
Sure.
and I suppose if I look at today when I am dealing with companies, who very very structured in the sense that people come through and they work in a department or they're a specialist in a certain area. My feeling is it's very one-dimensional as far as who you can be as a person and who
Right.
you can be in
Right.
business, and so that that type of fluid approach probably benefited me.
Yeah, absolutely. What was the first job you took coming out of university?
The first job, working at Hungry Jack's, which is equivalent to Burger King.
Right,
It's a,
right.
so
Yeah,
it's actually literally Burger King in Australia with a different name.
yeah.
Yeah, doing an evening shift making hamburgers. Um, it was pretty exciting. I did get fired from the job. Um, I found that I wasn't a good employee. Um, so yeah, I don't think the boss appreciated my critique. Um, and then after that, I was stacking shelves at a large supermarket chain at night, so what they called night fill. So back in those days,
Sure.
the supermarkets actually used to close at 6 o'clock,
Yep.
and so you'd go in afterwards and you'd restack the shelves. Um, it really taught you what you didn't want to do in life.
Right, right.
So,
Those are good jobs to have early on. I always tell my audience, figure out what you don't want to do early on, right?
I mean,
And that way, help you know your choices.
I mean, the funny thing is here in Australia, those jobs actually pay quite well.
Uh-huh.
It's
Right,
so
right,
you can actually see how you can get into this sort of lull of it's not a challenging role quite clearly, and people get into that, but it's one of these things where you go, that's another insight, and it does push you in the direction of it's the sink or swim situation.
sure.
You can either cruise or you can jump in deep and see what comes from it.
Right, right, cool. Well, you obviously spent over 30 years in the beauty care business, and we talked a little bit about that a couple of weeks ago when we connected. Worked with a lot of different contract manufacturers, and now you're one yourself. So
Yep.
tell us a little bit about how that transitioned. Did you go to work for mom soon thereafter and into that business, or did you strike out on your own in the industry?
I suppose look, I always stayed connected to the family company and
Right,
had an involvement in that over the decades. Um, but I struck out pretty early, so I think by the early 90s I had connected with a company in Belgium who were, I suppose, very specific in the area. They were manufacturing and developing products for the sort of the higher end spa sector.
right,
And I connected them through our family company, and I got involved with them for a good part of the 90s,
mm,
and came on board as I suppose sales and marketing for Southeast Asia, and that gave me, I suppose, the first big insight to, I suppose, the international platforms and what's
right,
out there. So that sort of led me down this path from, you know, seeing the product development and manufacturing insights, seeing the pluses and minuses. Very innovative company, but certainly lacked a structure and direction that would actually sustain them long term. But that landed me um, at the seat of at a seat with a joint venture in China in '97,
all
and
right, cool.
so I'm at this stage I'm quite young still, and here I am in a country that has a whole new set of rules, um, and getting to see the insights there. So Aus- Australia to China isn't so bad. I think it's, I don't know, maybe for us it's short. It's probably about an 8 hour flight.
Right,
Uh, and so you end up in this sort of shuttling situation where you're going backwards and forwards, and that's kind of where I suppose my eyes opened. Okay, the world is bigger than Australia. The world is bigger than one country, um, and to be seeing China prior to its really big boom, which happened in the 2000s, provides you a lot of insight. So I think that's kind of like the journey where it's throw yourself out there and see what comes from it, and that
right.
provided a lot of insights to where I am now.
Yeah, awesome. When was the first time you started managing people?
Um, it was actually, look, when I joined my mum's company, was um, that was my role, sadly. Um, so that was a very big insight.
Yeah.
So coming in at 19 and managing staff who were 20 years plus older than me.
Wow. Yeah.
I mean, obviously from their point of view, it's like it's the boss's son,
Right,
and
right, right.
I get it. I see their perspective, but at the same time, it's fairly obvious if you're doing your job right or not.
Yeah.
And
What were
that,
some of the lessons learned during that period?
this is going to sound really harsh, but the first thing, I suppose my first big insight was, if you let, like, there's one thing nurturing, and I'm all for nurturing. I'm all for giving people the ability to take a lead and discover what's possible. But at the same
Right.
time, if it's toxic, they have to go.
Yeah.
It doesn't inspire a great culture.
No, absolutely.
And my first lesson is, back then, was the industrial relations system in Australia. So, that was interesting. I did have to terminate a staff member quite early,
Mm.
and my lesson was, in Australia at the time, terminating was very tough.
Yeah.
I ended up in court and all sorts of things, and we did.
Was it a union environment, I presume?
No, it wasn't a union environment.
Yeah.
We have a fairly tough industrial relations system. It
Right.
doesn't, you know, it's there to protect workers, and I'm totally for that. The flip side to it is, sometimes it allows people to
Take advantage of the system.
take advantage, and
Yeah. Yeah.
in that particular situation, it was that case, and we did prevail. It was very much a very good lesson. But the lesson was about, at a certain point in time, if something's not working, don't hold on to it hoping that it will change.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and
Right.
and that was a really good early lesson, and it's something I've carried forward. And I have been in the situation multiple times since, where we've had to let people go, and it has ended up in legal situations. But you can't be afraid of that,
Yeah.
because
Right.
to hold for eternity is to actually, well, number one, set a bad example for the rest of your team. But the other
Of
side
course.
is, you are now setting yourself up for literally failure as a company,
Right.
because
Right.
if you don't have a great team of people, then what are you? I mean, you're a name, but you don't have the skills, or you don't have the commitment from the people around you to take you to where you need to be. And
Right.
I mean, even to this day, that's one of the really big lessons. And if I go back, you know, just as the pandemic started last year, I remember standing there with all our team, and everybody's looking at me going, what's going on?
What's next? Yeah.
And
Right.
and I
Right.
stood there with everybody, and we didn't know if we were going to go into a global recession, if the world was
Right.
falling apart. And I
Right.
stood there and
Right.
said, okay, nobody needs to panic. Um, I will pay all your wages for the next 12 months, even if we don't generate one
Mm.
cent. I said,
Wow.
we've got a great team of people, and this is right down to the person on the production line. Um,
Yeah.
I had one of my production managers come to me and say, should I be looking? Literally said, I've got an offer from a friend to work elsewhere. Do you mind if I just leave and take that job while I feel
Huh.
safe? And I said to her, I said, look, I totally understand where you're coming from. You've got a responsibility to your family, but uh, don't worry, we have enough cash in the bank to take us through. We're prepared. And it was about, we can buy, as I say to my staff, look, I can go out and buy equipment. That's easy, but I can't buy people. We've got a great team
Right.
of people.
Right.
We'll hold you together. So one of those elements I've looked at over the years is, if you have a great team of people
Yeah.
and you manage that effectively, that will lead your company to the next level through highs and lows. And it does make you more astute as an employer about who you do hire as well.
Absolutely.
Do they fit my
And
culture?
people repay you back for that loyalty too, Rohan, don't they?
Oh,
By stating your willingness to stand behind them, they do buckle up and say, yes, I want to stay with you as well. Did that happen with that particular employee? Did she stay on?
yeah. Look, and she's one of
Yeah.
she's one of our best team members.
Yeah. It's
And
awesome.
and look, she's young, and one of the things I think she's learnt in the last year is that nothing in business is black and white. And
Right. Right.
I think the nurturing we've done with her has paid us back tenfold, because then obviously she's leading her team of people, and she's taking that same philosophy through to them.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that makes, I think, even on that level, it just makes us a more efficient and
Yeah.
focused company.
Huge difference. So you were on the manufacturing and uh, consumer side of it very long, and with new laboratories, you've switched to the contract side. We talked a little bit about your thinking behind that because I think you kind of had to do a little bit of a 180. So talk to us a little bit about that. How did you kind of make that transition from being on the branded side, right, for so many years of your career, to starting new laboratories?
Yeah, so we I worked on the branded side of the industry for a long time, and we did it with one of the companies I was leading. We were manufacturing our own brand, and we, I think we got to a certain point that for me it was a fork in the road.
Yeah.
Back in 2014, we had our son William, and that kind of, I suppose, for me changed the perspective about who I was and what I was doing. I was spending
Mm.
a good slice of my year on the road overseas,
Traveling, right? Yeah.
and traveling, and that's something, I suddenly just didn't want to do. And
Right.
um, you know, I think one of the things that I'm sort of rolling forward now, and you're in 2018, I was pretty much at the point where it's like, look, everything I'd set myself up for retirement was there. So by that time, off the top of my head, 2018, I'm in my, well, I suppose now I'm verging on 50, and I'm asking myself the question, is this really where I want to go? And then
Yeah.
um, a former team member who was working in the raw material side of the industry kind of said to me, "Have you ever thought about contract manufacturing?" And I was
Mm.
like, "Have I ever thought about dealing with other people's problems? No, I haven't."
Taking a gun to
And
my head.
yeah, it's like, and I looked at the contract manufacturing landscape previously, and all I saw was, you know, literally you are playing with a whole lot of people's problems and issues that I really didn't want at that point. But
Yeah, yeah. And
um,
you'd worked with them previously, right? You had suppliers and vendors that were contract manufacturers.
yeah, well, look, that's correct. So, I mean, there's a funny story how the brand I was running even ended up in our own manufacturing space. So we were a client of a contract manufacturer here in Australia, and our understanding, we were one of their bigger clients, and we were very involved client. We weren't just this hands off. We even had a team member on site full time managing
Wow.
our issues. It's very unusual, sort of situation. And then one day they came along to me and said, "We know how well you're doing," and I'm like, "Sure, we're doing well, fantastic. We know how much money you're making." I'm sitting there going, "How could you know how much money we're making?
Mm.
What we spend with you is no reflection about our bottom line. You have no idea of
Right.
our costs." And so they said, "Well, we're going to put your prices up."
Ah,
I'm like, "Oh, sure, that's what you do." And you had prices double and triple overnight.
wow.
And I thought, well, contract manufacturing is not profit sharing. Um,
No.
it's a process of, you deliver quality, we pay you on time, and in our case, we paid them every single week, and that pivoted. I suppose I got to thank them now. They kind of provided me an insight into what's possible, and I pivoted literally overnight into manufacturing, and
Mm.
very, what's the word? I suppose naive to some extent. I went, okay,
Mm.
sure, we can do this. Hopped on a plane, went and saw all the machinery companies we needed. Um, Literally just went with an open checkbook. In some cases, we were flying, 2, 3 ton machines in by plane.
Wow. Wow.
And we moved that fast where it was like, we can't wait 2 months for shipping. We need to fly it in.
Huh.
To pivot, I literally went out and bought a factory. I even remember doing the deal as the plane landed back in Melbourne with the real estate agent, and bought the factory whilst disembarking, which I can imagine the people around me going, "What's this?
What's going on here?
What's going on here?" By the time I got off the plane, we owned a factory, um,
Wow.
but it was very much, you know, you throw yourself in deep. the worst you can do is fail. Um,
Right.
but
Right.
I've always had this philosophy, which is, failure to plan is planning to fail.
Yeah.
It is with, plans in the background, but that led us into manufacturing, which led us into making our own brand, which got me to this point in 2018 where I'm sitting there going, it's retirement time.
Mm.
I've worked hard, I've prepared for this, and then it's suddenly like, uh, okay, let's go back to the casino, let's roll the dice, and over one weekend, and I think it was in September, October of 2018, I sat down and said, okay, this is where we're going. So, and then Monday morning we woke up as New Laboratories, um, which kind of, I suppose, surprised most of my staff who didn't realise what we were suddenly going to be.
Right.
And some of those staff, it didn't work for them in terms of the new
Yeah.
context, and they did move on. And that
Mm.
that was very much a voluntary situation where it's like this is a very different dynamic. So when you're manufacturing for yourself, you've got time to get things in a certain way. When you're manufacturing
Right.
with somebody else, it's a different pace and it's
Yeah.
it's a
Yeah.
different demand, and it demands a level of creativity and lateral thinking. It's not just about,
Innovation. Yeah.
yeah,
Right.
it's a whole different world. So that went from zero, and it sort of, I think it had a level of this momentum where you kind of saw there was brands out there who were looking for a new home where somebody actually understood what a brand was. And I think that's what we discovered quite early
Mm.
on was our point of difference was that most contract manufacturers, they came from a business management point of view, or they were
Right.
cosmetic chemists who morphed into something different. Um, but very few came from the point of view of what it means to be a brand, to
Yeah.
understand the
Yeah.
metrics. So when a client was coming to us with some great idea that had no financial hope of succeeding, you would sit down and say, look, can I suggest a different way around this?
Right. Right.
And I think one of our most successful clients was actually one of our first. Who,
Mm.
the little story there was she, and she still tells it to me from time to time was, um, you know, she called around various manufacturers with her idea, and nobody would give it a time of day.
Mm.
And apparently, I don't even recall the conversation, but apparently I spent 2 hours on the phone talking about everything, sharing my insights. And she hopped off the phone and said, "That's my manufacturer,"
Wow.
and came in and saw us. And it was a really small production run to start with, and her idea, I looked at and said, that's a good way to fail. I do remember the meeting, and
Yeah.
I'm,
Yeah.
I'm looking at it, what she wanted. I'm like, nobody's buying this, and we came up with a different approach to it.
Yeah.
But that morphed her into, I think she does maybe 10, 15 million turnover.
Nice.
And that's in the space of a few years. She was,
Yeah.
um, I think mid 20s at the time, mortgaged her home,
Mm.
wanted to start this brand, and you look at it from that sort of point of view, and you go, look, I'm gonna salute you for taking a risk, but
Right. Right.
take an educated risk, and
Right.
and, and I
Right.
think that's where a good contract manufacturer comes in, and they understand where you've been and say, look, risk, go for it, but it's got to be calculated and it's got to be
Right.
commercial. It's got to be something that consumers are going to love. And I think that's where our point of difference is. And we want to see our clients succeed because quite clearly
Sure.
they succeed, we succeed.
You
Uh,
succeed. Yeah.
um,
Well, is that kind of one of your key points of difference and competitive advantage in the sense that you really do work with them and helping them develop their ideas further beyond their original concept?
100%. And look,
Yeah.
it doesn't matter whether they're a startup or an established company.
Yeah. Right. Right.
We say quite clearly, we say, look, we're not here to run your brand and tell you what to do, but we're going to offer our insights because at the end of the day, if you just manufacture this once, it's been a
Yeah.
waste of time for you and us. It hasn't
That's
hasn't
right. Yeah.
hasn't achieved anything. What we look for in our clients is hopefully what they look for in us, which is a long-term relationship. And
Yeah.
we say quite openly, this is a marriage.
Right.
you've got to be
Right.
sure that the person you're going to be bedding down with for the next couple of years or even decade is the right person. Otherwise, this is going to fail. And,
Right.
and, and look, we've passed on clients that are, very successful based on it's not a the relationship doesn't feel good,
Right,
and
right,
so it's not about for us money's everything. It's about the relationship, because if it's a great relationship, it means my team will engage, and it's also about how much they're enjoying their roles.
of course.
And
Yeah,
we've had some amazing people come to us, and we've sat back and said, this is a babysitting role.
right,
That's not who
right.
we are.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
We're not going to. We, we're happy to show you the pathway, but we're not going to take you down that pathway step by step. You've got to do something. And I think the best relationships we have with our clients are the ones who, it's not about them listening to everything we say, it's about them taking on our ideas and making them their own.
Right,
Um,
right.
and but if we have to spoon feed the client every step, I think that's not the best relationship,
No, no.
because they're not
And
going
it's
to.
not fun.
It's
Let's face it.
it's not
At
it's
the end of the day,
it's not
you've got to enjoy what you're doing.
look, 100%, and
Yeah,
it's not an enjoyable experience where the client will keep will not listen to the cues you're sending them. They have to at some point take responsibility for who they are as a person and as a company. Um,
right,
and you know the feedback overall is, you know, our team works well with people who are engaged at the same level. It's,
right.
you know,
Yeah,
we'll suggest this. We're not saying do it, but if you don't even explore it and
yeah,
come up with
right.
an idea, then how is this going to work?
Yeah, yeah. How many employees today at New Labs?
Um, we're 25, which in
Right,
manufacturing sometimes seems small, but
right.
one of the one of the other things I learned very clearly in the early days is you cannot succeed in our industry by throwing more people at the solution.
Right, right.
Um, and that's one of the things that we learned. I learned, I think, on day one, where you stand back and say, without being harsh, isn't there a machine for that? Um,
Right, right, right.
and I think our innovation, on that side has been what's led given us that strength. I
Yeah,
would probably say, in most manufacturing spaces, for what we do, you would need probably 75 to 100 people.
yeah. Wow.
And our investment on the technology side's been huge. I mean, there's,
Yeah,
you
much
know,
more efficient.
yeah, I mean, and I think one of the things we've looked at very clearly from the word go is, um, you know, you you've got to have people, obviously, because you know that's an important part of about how we innovate from the product development side. We've got a great team of chemists. You can't mechanize that. But when it comes down to the production side, you have to have a great team of people on quality control, because
Sure.
whilst there are machines you can pick up elements of quality control, there's a human element that's really important. But repetitive tasks, we looked and said they just have to be automated, because
Right.
economically in Australia, where our wages are very high, like
Yeah,
I
yeah.
mean, your average production worker is probably earning anywhere from, you know, 33 to up to $45 an hour.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You cannot win by just putting more people on the line.
Right, right.
It doesn't work. So that's probably been one of our big strengths.
Yeah,
It has been,
Ha-
how can we succeed with a smaller team of people?
yeah. How has your leadership style evolved over time?
My personal leadership style, that's a very interesting one. I think I've learned to stand back.
Mm,
Um, you know, it you, you start. I think empowering the team to take responsibility has been one of the hardest lessons I've had to do.
right.
Um, I think I'm a born micromanager,
Mm,
and that just comes from, go back to my early days. It's
right.
if you want something, you've got to do it yourself. Um, through to, okay, let's have a project meeting and then move forward. So it's interesting. If I go back to 2018, every day I'd probably spend the vast majority of my time on the factory floor, um,
Right, right.
dealing with issues. And today, when I walk in each day, um, it, it's rare. Some days I just even don't go onto the factory floor now, which is a bit of a sign that, you know, the nurturing and the empowering the team
Mm.
has given them that confidence to just go ahead and do it. And
Right,
for me to
right.
also realize I'm not the solution to everything. That you need that you need that team of people around you. So that my style has changed quite dramatically in the last few years.
Yeah, cool. What do you look for when you invest in people you hire and bring into the company?
Um, the, I suppose what I'm looking for is their point of difference.
Mm.
Um, what I mean, what can you bring to the party? I mean, just an example is we hired a new chemist, well, probably late last year, and she was younger. She'd worked at a large company for 2 years out of university, and we kind of had this sort of broad-ranging discussion. I should sort of preface this. On the phone, we talked a little bit about what the role was, and
Mm-hmm, mm.
and we were talking about a project we were looking at, this particular product. And she came to the interview with a sample of the product. She decided in her own little home lab to,
Oh,
to
made it herself.
made it herself. And she actually came to the interview with this actual product and said,
Wow.
I wanted to show you this based on what we talked about. And I suppose if you look at that, I said, well, okay, that person's taken initiative.
Yeah, right.
And and that's one of the things we look at when we're hiring is
Sure.
do we I suppose the question we have is, do we need another person in a role, or do we need somebody who's going to take the initiative and going to take on innovation as part of uh, their, their their core responsibility? and
Right,
and that,
right.
I mean, that that also applies to somebody who might come. I mean, the example, if I look at our production manager, she came in as somebody who's literally was a pack and fill role on the production line,
Mm.
and she went from there's her hourly rate and through to um, she's now a salary. She's on salary. She's got
Great.
security, and
Yeah.
and the interesting thing about this, when people meet her, they're expecting to see a production manager who's 40 years old. Uh, she's 21.
Wow, that's
Okay,
amazing.
right.
Yeah.
So in 2 years she's been with us. She went from that to production manager, and she actually, I suppose, she was she sat back and watched all the other production managers come and go, all the seasoned professionals,
Right.
and the one thing I think she learned from it is you have to lead by example rather
Mm.
than telling people go do it.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's one of the things. Once again, it's like she took initiative, and I remember when we and how she sort of stepped up into the role. Once again, same thing. It's we were relocating just as the pandemic hit last March to a new factory, and obviously I know my team, but I didn't really know a lot about her. And she stepped up to
Right.
me and she just said, look, with this move, do you want me to go get a forklift license, because we're gonna need extra people moving backwards and forwards on both ends of the old factory, the new
The plant.
factory.
Yeah.
And I'm
Right.
like, sure,
Okay.
okay, okay,
That's initiative.
that's initiative. So she actually, that was that one little simple thing she did, where
Yeah.
she's like,
Yeah.
everybody else was just like, okay, tell me my job, and
Right.
she
Right.
stepped up and said, hey, and I went, sure, you know,
What a difference
we
that makes.
we
Yeah.
got we got her a license the next week, and then a few months later, the current production manager, who'd been, I suppose, been there long enough, had said, "Look, it's time for me to go. I've had enough."
Mm.
Some people look for greener pastures, and this person stepped into the role
Yeah.
and and hasn't looked back since. And
Never
and
looked back. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that's one of the
That's
things. It's like, don't tell me you want a job. Tell me what it is you're
yeah.
going to bring to the job.
Right. Right.
And I think that's one of the lessons we've had on the hiring side. It
Yeah.
hasn't always been
That's
an
awesome.
easy conversation, because sometimes
Yeah.
people have come from a big corporate setting, and that may
Right. Right.
provide them the support systems and the comfort. Whereas, I've still maintained a level of, you've got a level of innovation in what you do as a person. You can't ask for everything up front. You've got to show what you can deliver.
Yeah. Well, Rohan, we're just about out of time, but we always have one last question we ask our guests. And what career and life advice would you give someone that perhaps has his or her eyes on the corner office, or like yourself, has decided that they really want to be an entrepreneur after maybe working for others for so many years?
That's a great question. I suppose the best advice, and I always look back and say, what advice would I give my 20-year-old self?
There you go.
And that's how I always look at it, is if you're starting out and this is where you want to be, it's, take off the parachute, dive in head deep, be prepared to fail. You probably will fail at some stage, but that is a learning lesson in life, and take all the lessons you have, and then that will get you to where you need to be. And that's always been my philosophy. It's, if you don't take a risk, there is no reward. So if you want the corner office, if you want my corner office, then it's time to take the parachute off and dive deep.
Yeah, love it. Well, Rohan Widdison, thank you so much, CEO of New Laboratories. Thank you so much for sharing your journey into the corner office.
And thanks so much for your time, Brant.
Thank you for listening to Into the Corner Office with Brant Hanley. We hope you enjoyed hearing our guest CEO story as much as we did. If you want to hear more CEOs reveal their journey into the corner office, please subscribe via iTunes and tell your friends and colleagues. For more information about Brant, Resource Options International, and the mighty middle market, visit www.goforroi.com. We look forward to having you join us for our next episode.